Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Before we move on to the first keynote of this day, we're very fortunate to have this panel, which really sort of like setting the scene, I suppose, discussing some of the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. Before I introduce the speakers, just a quick note on the format. I'm going to turn to our speakers to provide some opening remarks, framing thoughts on the topic, and then move on to a moderated conversation with me, with our two speakers, and then open the floor up for some question and answers. To start with, welcome back, Ambassador Prasad. Thank you for being with us last year and for joining us today as well. Ambassador Prasad is Fiji's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, and Fiji's non-resident High Commissioner to Canada. Ambassador Prasad is very well known in New York and in DC, and leads a lot of the work on climate and ocean issues, both within the UN processes and in other multilateral settings, such as the World Bank and the High-Level Panel on Oceans. And to turn to my right, welcome Nilanthi Samaranayake from Washington, DC, who is the Director of Strategy and Policy Analysis Program at the Center for Naval Analysis. And Nilanthi studies small states and international affairs, US alliances and partnerships, and Indian Ocean regional security. I'll turn to Ambassador Prasad first to make your framing comments and your remarks, and you're more than welcome to do it here or from the podium, whichever. Sure. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much, Darshana and colleagues. Welcome. Thank you very much for having us and also convening this dialogue with the Pacific Islands. I've been given about 7 minutes, so I'll try to stick to that. But let me really genuinely express my thanks, Darshana, Carnegie, and Sasakawa for framing these discussions, now beginning to become part of the annual UNGA setting. It's a fantastic opportunity for Pacific Island and the broader global community and the US to interact. And I think there's a lot to be said for how to take this forward. So I'm very excited to be here, and hope Carnegie will continue to support this. It's an ongoing process. I will make a few observations that I hope will help to frame some of the discussions on the Pacific Island part of the oceans island dialogue that you're having. I cannot make many remarks about our Indian Ocean cousins, but I'm sure there's sort of intersection. So some introductory remarks, especially for our audiences both here and online, who are not on a day-to-day basis very engaged with the Pacific side. And I think this is very important for us. For those of you who are engaged very deeply, I will apologize. So first is that the Blue Pacific, the way in which we refer to our part of the Pacific, is very large. It's covers 15% of the planet's surface. We steward the world's largest ocean and ecosystem. I will not throw numbers on how many square miles to confuse you on a Sunday afternoon, but it is very large relative to other regions. We are vaster than the vast. Second is Blue Pacific is diverse. In the island states of the Pacific, that excludes Australia and New Zealand, you'll find roughly 900 of the world's languages, just less than a fifth of the world's languages that are alive, full of linguistic heartbeat, and shared by a combined population of less than 10 million. Get used to our diversity across the Sea of Islands. Third is that the Blue Pacific is thriving. People, communities, countries across the Blue Pacific are on the move, building their economies, expanding travel, connecting with the rest of the world, welcoming the world. You will meet Pacific Islands in the Land's End in the UK. That's right at the northern tip of UK. You will meet them in Arkansas, in Alaska. Probably your cod on the table has been caught by Fijian or Samoan fishermen, across Europe, and of course in Australasia. within this decade, you'll begin to see more of us, I hope, in the cabinets of Australia and New Zealand, in local governments in US and Canada and elsewhere. Get used to that too. The Blue Pacific is an oceanic superpower. Its vastness is its main weapon. Every third breath that you take comes from the Blue Pacific. A large proportion of medicines for our shared future will come from the biodiversity of the Blue Pacific. We are gateway to the Indo-Pacific. We are a massive supplier of blue foods. Much of the tuna that you eat in New York comes from Pacific's waters, and I hope they're legal rather than of the illegal type. Much of the nutrition for a climate-stressed planet will most likely come from the Blue Pacific in future. Our ocean unites us. They don't separate us. Our 40 million square kilometers of the ocean unites us as a group of nations. It is the basis of our kinship, cultural ties that connects families, businesses, churches, communities across the region. For several centuries, our region has hosted external empires. Most have not gone the distance. So we're quite used to this subject matter we're discussing today. Our core message to the world are that you need to work with us and not against us. The world must protect its vast natural assets together, and the Pacific peoples are responsible for some of the most important sources of biodiversity. While humility is in our bones as Pacific peoples, we know when to raise our voices when it matters most. Sovereignty matters to us. It matters to us a lot more because our colonial histories are far more recent for us than for people and states across Asia and Africa who acquired the independence many decades earlier. Our region remains disproportionately represented in the decolonization committees list on the United Nations, for example. And the prevailing narrative views that Pacific Island states are subject to the whims of larger powers is quite false. Earlier this year, I read a headline views on one of the American news sites that said, China seeks to buy 8 Pacific Island nations. I can assure you that Pacific Island states cannot be bought. We make strategic assessments of how to maximize the benefits of our many partnerships for our people's benefit. Within that calculus are the strength of our climate commitments, our desire to expand opportunities and capacity, and the values that we hold dear. And these include democracy, transparency, but by far the most important of all elements in this calculus is equality. Multilateralism matters to you, the large countries. It matters a lot more to us, the small states in the Pacific. In it, we find the comfort of the collective rules of the international system, be they be in trade, or security, on oceans, and nearly everything that works. Our region has seen a recent step up in engagement that we fully welcome because we don't view any country as a threat to the Pacific after decades of long dearth of engagement. After the Second World War, every country has a lot of diplomatic ground to make up. Peace matters to us. It probably matters to you, the large powers as well. No Pacific Island state has ever invaded another state. No Pacific state has been or wants to be part of any power projection by another. This is so because we are a peaceful people. This is even more so because we have witnessed close hand what wars do. Some of the brutalest and the fiercest wars 8 decades ago were fought in the Pacific. It is in the Blue Pacific where large powers tested and perfected their nuclear weapons. These are fresh in our minds, codified in our songs, dances, and stories, largely forgotten and ignored by others. Agency matters to us, as it does to you. Voice matters to the small states of the Pacific, as it matters to you, the larger countries. We want to be heard, so do you. 60% of the world's trade moves across the Blue Pacific. The Blue Pacific connects Asia, the engine of the world economy, to the Americas. We are not stepping stones on the sea lanes of global trade. We have a stake in all aspects of these trade routes. We want them to be green, in case you have not heard that before. The notion that we are part of someone's backyard rather than sovereign nation belongs obviously to a last century. Whether we are worthy of genuine partnerships is a choice for other countries to make. We are here, we are welcoming, we are genuine when we say we welcome you. Development matters to us, as it does to you. All the rules of the development system, from finance to trade, were designed when most of us were colonies. We were not at the decision-making table. Our colonial masters may have inadvertently mostly misspoken on our behalf in those periods. What we've left with is a global financial system designed for the benefit of larger countries. So we find that usually in the global development debates, most of your large developing countries in the rich industrial world are more or less on one side of the table, and we, small states of the Pacific, on another side of the table, together with our Caribbean and Indian Ocean cousins. A table that small states did not have a voice in building. In the geopolitical contestation in the current era, you will present your frameworks to engage with the Blue Pacific. The only frameworks that matter to us are frameworks that the Blue Pacific shapes, agrees to, and proposes. Today, that is the Blue Pacific's 2050 strategy. Today, it is the many specific sector arrangements, such as our fisheries management treaties. Today, it is our shared aspiration to grow our exports from across our islands, smell a good Papua New Guinea coffee and engage with that. Occasionally, we raise our voices too. Occasionally, we do get angry. We cannot understand why large emitters are embarking on the path to suicide. We understand that they may have no interest in saving us, but climate affects ordinary people everywhere, from those struggling in China's floods, to those baking in European heat waves, to those whose lives are destroyed year in and year out in the American wildfires. So let me say this as diplomatically as I can. If you are committed to a zero by 2050, you are with us. If you are not committed to zero by 2050, you are not with us. Nor are you with your own people. We sometimes raise our voices on matters in a pitch. This is unusually unpacific. This is so because the English language seems to fail us in expressing the depth of our sentiments or the scale of our difficulties. A single extreme weather event, such as Cyclone Pem in Vanuatu, wiped off 70% of the value of its GDP, a number that appears to be lost to many observers. USA's GDP is approximately 20 trillion. Try imagining if you wiped off 14 trillion of the US economy in a few hours, or 2.1 trillion of the Indian economy in 2 hours. In one extreme weather event in 2016, some 30% of Fiji schools were lost, damaged, or severely damaged. Imagine if China lost nearly 200,000 of its schools out of its 600,000 schools in a few hours. So we get frustrated because solidarity is bountiful in the wake of immediate climate emergencies. And we thank many of our partners. I guess in those moments, countries remember fondly my point number 10, that none of the Pacific Island states have invaded another country during these times. When the humanitarian phase is over, when the cameras are gone, in the hard fiscal grind of building jetties, rebuilding jetties and roads, and the bridges that get washed away, and the water systems that have been destroyed, it is back to hard and painful external borrowing. Solidarity dies a quick death. So we frame our relations in the geopolitical context from this starting point, yet again, of the climate emergency. And as individual states with sovereign agency, we are unambiguous in this. As states with shared sovereignty through our regional settings, such as Pacific Island Forum, we are unambiguous in this. Our civil society is unambiguous in this. Our faith communities are unambiguous in this. And that is a starting point. I hope that was serviceable as a few framing remarks. If the Washington Post or New York Times or other US press are here, I can almost guarantee that the question that you will pose to me will be about AUKUS or Solomon Islands, I will refer you to the Fijian Prime Minister, Honorable Frank Bainimarama's own words. Great power competition means less than little to anyone whose community is slipping beneath the rising seas. The greatest threat we face isn't geopolitics, it is climate change. Help us tell that story. Your future also depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that great set of framing remarks. I think there's a lot to think through that, and for speaking directly to, I guess, to audience here watching virtually, but also to those who will probably report on some of these. May I turn to you, Nilanthi, now to provide a perspective on the Indian Ocean, but also how Washington is looking at some of these issues.
Sure. Thank you, Darshana, for the invitation to be here today. Good afternoon, everyone. I was asked to provide framing remarks about the growing attention that we're seeing to islands in the Indian Ocean segment of the Indo-Pacific, and in particular, the recent developments in Sri Lanka, which has received much attention. So I'm happy to share some of my personal research on this topic. As we're thinking about the Indian Ocean region, I'd like to share a framework that I think is useful when trying to enhance our understanding of island states in the region. Much analysis of the international relations of the Indo-Pacific is focused on great and major powers, such as the United States, China, and India. But the examination often ends there. There is what I think of as the chessboard view, what major powers can do to achieve their interests as they look at those smaller countries in the region, where the major powers are the actors. Then there is the being played off view, what is done unto major powers, how they feel treated by smaller states. But I would offer a third lens, which is viewing Indian Ocean dynamics from the perspectives of smaller countries on their terms. Analytically, I think it's a useful contribution to the current discourse, but also normatively speaking, this point of view helps, I think, to enhance their agency in the conversation. Although the region's island countries, they may be smaller in size, factors such as their strategic locations, their relations with an increasingly strong India, growing ties with China, and trade and investment opportunities all serve to make them an important area of inquiry. One caveat, before we think about them collectively, we must note the diversity of Indian Ocean islands. Some are geographic, they span continents, such as the subregion of South Asia and the African littoral, as we heard in the previous discussion. Réunion has a unique relationship to the region due to its French identity. They also participate in different regional architecture, from the African Union to SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. And economically, they range from high income to several lower middle income countries, such as Comoros, and low income in Madagascar, which is facing famine in the south and is confronted by the threat of climate change. We're recently seeing a lot of attention to the state's debt levels, particularly after Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt for the first time in its history and saw converging economic, political, and social crises. So once we acknowledge their diversity, it is useful to think about the Indian Ocean islands as a key grouping. And I see a framework with 3 components that can enhance our understanding of these smaller states. So first, they have a set of shared needs. These are often in the context of non-traditional security challenges. Second, they have shared concerns, and this can be in the traditional security sense and great power rivalry. And then third, they have surprising strengths despite their smaller size. So first, in terms of needs, there are common capacity needs, such as to support their maritime security services, and in particular, to respond to non-traditional security issues. These are challenges that go beyond solely state-based conceptions of security and transcend national boundaries. They include illegal fishing, narcotics trafficking, and natural disasters. So to address these threats, the island states often depend on larger powers for assistance, such as training and exercises for their coast guards, as well as equipment and platforms to advance regional maritime security. For example, in 2020, Mauritius faced the environmental disaster of an oil spill after a tanker ran aground, and it benefited from assistance from various international actors. France and India deployed naval platforms, and Japan provided assistance as well. Second, shared concerns. These are often in the realm of traditional security, where smaller island states express concerns about the misuse of their territory by major powers and concern about their ability to craft independent foreign policies. For example, India faced protests in Seychelles when the public and legislators were concerned about plans for a potential military base on Assumption Island. The United States faced controversy and eventual rejection by Maldives and Sri Lanka for proposed military status of forces agreements. Britain's sovereignty over the Chagos Islands has been contested by Mauritius through successful efforts in multiple international legal and diplomatic forums, but with little change on the ground. And most recently, we saw Sri Lanka conduct frantic diplomacy last month with both India and China after its decision to permit a visit by a Chinese ship to Hambantota port. And then third, there are strengths that don't often receive attention and can surprise observers. Small island states are thought leaders on addressing the global challenge of climate security due to existential threats such as rising sea levels and flooding. For example, Maldives has chaired the Alliance of Small Island States and was one of the first countries to ratify the Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. Also, the locations of these island states provide them with strategic and commercial advantages. For example, Sri Lanka has operated the busiest container port in South Asia at Colombo. And Mauritius is a financial hub and top country in Africa for ease of doing business. I'll pause there and note that this is one framework and hope we can encourage greater study and discussion of Indian Ocean islands. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilanthi. Thank you both for those framing remarks, and Ambassador Prasad for framing the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific within the climate urgency. And as my Vice President mentioned in his opening remarks, we are looking at climate from different angles tomorrow as well, both from the point of view of maritime security, climate change, but also accessibility to climate finance. And I have heard you talk about the issues of climate finance, and you did refer to financial systems that are geared or shaped in a way that you mentioned benefit the developed world. But we do hear so much of it that says there's X number of aid fund or finance available for vulnerable nations, SIDS nations, or countries who are vulnerable to climate change. I was wondering if you'd want to speak a little bit more on that issue of that you mentioned in terms of the financial systems and what they're gearing to offer, but that it's not accessible in a way that's perhaps is needed by SIDS nations.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for the previous comments as well. As I had said, across the development system, there are a whole variety of interlocking challenges that the Pacific small states, but many other small states find themselves. One is just ease of access of any finance. If you're a large country with large economies, etc., you can go to the market, no problem, and nothing. The markets are very happy. We have far more limitations of going to the private markets for any financing, just because the economies of scale, the size of the investments needed are not attractive to private finance. So that already cuts out the largest source of financing that is available. Second, then in the multilateral system, small states go through exactly the same procedures for accessing any finance that a large country such as India or China would do if they're accessing this finance. Exactly the same. And in Tuvalu's Ministry for Economy, Finance may have 12 or 13 professional staff working on this, as opposed to a country such as India, or larger country might have 50 or 60 people working. So just your ability to walk through the systems of global finance to access emergency funds to respond to some infrastructure needs. It's just not there. And then the assuming that somehow you magically get above the capacity constraint. Then third is whether there's finance at all available. On the climate finance, especially, this is a small pot of resources that now almost every country, developing country, finds themselves on the climate front lines, and we all compete for the same resources, right? We're in the same competition, and it is oversubscribed. Climate finance in the Green Climate Fund, for example, the 100 billion that commitment made to in 2010 remains undelivered, and we hope that it will be fulfilled. It goes somewhere. So there's a whole hierarchy of difficulties that multiply manyfold. Anyone who has been in the overall, has worked in a Ministry for Economy and Finance will know on the infrastructure side, if you don't keep pace with one, repairing and rebuilding infrastructure, and two, if you don't keep pace with repairing in a normal way, very soon you'll have to replace the whole infrastructure. In a road, if you're not only repairing, rebuilding the bridges that get washed away, but also do not maintain it in tropical areas every 7 years in a significant way, within 7 years, you have to exactly rebuild the whole road. That's doing the whole thing over again, only in 7 years. Yeah, so that's Tuvalu, again, a bad example. It has to rebuild its airport about every 7 to 8 years. It has a single international airport that links it to the world. The cost of rebuilding the airport is equal to its entire annual budget.
Thank you, Master. One more question to you before I turn to you, Nilanthi. You also talked about kind of solidarity that comes in heaps after a disaster strikes, but when the cameras are off, it's hard to find. I wanted, since this is a panel on sort of the larger geopolitics of it, you're probably very focused on the General Assembly this week, but I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the Partnership for Blue Pacific that was announced recently, and that comprises of countries that are very present in the Pacific, and I suppose there will be a ministerial on the sidelines later this week. I wanted to ask you, these are countries that have been present in the Pacific for decades. These are countries that have been engaging with you bilaterally and at a regional level and at a multilateral level. So what is new this time? What would you, how is the region viewing it, and what would you like to see this Partnership for Blue Pacific really deliver on?
Okay, so it's a bit early to say. I mean, these discussions are taking place this week, and I understand on Thursday will be the first time the ministers have met on this. And for those of you who are not familiar, Partners of the Blue Pacific brings together Australia and New Zealand, who are in many cases already partners of the Blue Pacific. They're part of the Pacific Island Forum, and Japan and the US and a few other countries in a combined way. So it is achieving one very immediate, extremely positive outcome, is that these are a group of countries with whom we have deep and historic relations, etc., working together and against in response to priorities that we either as a group of countries or as individual countries present to them. So just working together makes more sense. And second is that there will be some additionality that comes out of this. We hope, it is my expectation, and I'm sure it will head in that direction. An example that I have discussed at some point, we have about 280 of coastal communities in Fiji are highly exposed to sea level rise, highly. Some of them need to be relocated. Often we see them as 280 individual projects. They're different villages and communities and different islands, etc. But if you bundle them all up into a single program and work with the partners on that single program, it suddenly becomes something that is digestible to the global system because the scale is so large. And then, based on the resources that they may bring to the table, Australia might pick up 5 or 6 of them, and US might pick up 10 or 20, and it becomes doable. So I think it will also in time, I hope that's my aspiration, lead to that. And the third, my comment on this is that it also brings together, it reduces the learning time. Each time a individual bilateral country engages with Tuvalu, Kiribati, etc., there's a lot of time they need to learn. They're not necessarily present on ground. And that's a couple of years of learning before an engagement takes shape, and then projects and programs take another couple of years, etc. So when you're pooling your resources together, you're pooling the learning together, you're pooling the tactics and the ideas and the knowledge. And I hope that will also lead to very positive outcome. And finally, it's a forum where I think the group of Pacific Island states and a group of countries that look at many areas of development and of strategic cooperation in similar ways that will help provide the platform for just doing things together better.
Thank you, Ambassador. Nilanthi, if I may turn to you and probably leverage you both working in Washington and your focus on the Indian Ocean. And sort of on maritime security, there's clearly, I was wondering if you'd wanted to share something on the sense in Washington from the new attention in the Pacific, because Pacific is not a new theater. Indian Ocean is still a little, I think, distant out from Washington's perspective, but whereas the driving force behind it, the thinking behind it. So, what is the concern? What is the challenge within the geopolitics of what we've heard, and also placing it against Ambassador Prasad's kind of remarks on how the region is viewing it and what the concerns or priorities are?
It's a good question, Darshana. My personal view, looking at the Indo-Pacific strategy, you can look for how many times the Indian Ocean is mentioned, just 2 times.
Twice in a 20-page document.
Right. But there are many mentions of the Pacific Islands in that document. So clearly the United States is saying in its highest level strategy documents the importance of the Pacific. And I think the Indian Ocean, it really is received secondary levels of attention. But we've seen across 2 administrations, great power competition discussed in the previous administration, strategic competition put forward in this one, really just thinking about those threats that are seen coming from China and Russia, especially since we've seen this year. So the United States, it needs to plan for those types of contingencies. So I think that is driving a lot of this recent attention that we've seen in the Pacific.
Another sort of phrase that I suppose we hear quite a bit when we talk about the Indo-Pacific is rules-based international order, right? And we hear it more and more from perhaps the bigger players, but Ambassador Prasad referred to it, that multilateralism and rules are important to the bigger powers, but it's even more important to smaller states. On the Indian Ocean side, there is a very sensitive and I think a sticking point, the Chagos Archipelago, where, at the UN, at the ICJ level, at the General Assembly level, the case has been Mauritius as one that its claims or its stance, but United Kingdom, neither United Kingdom or the United States has really accepted that and valid. How do you think that is playing out in the region in terms of the fact that what has been said by the General Assembly, what has been said by the advisory opinion of the ICJ to say that these belong to Mauritius, and it's not respected by 2 bigger players in the region? I wonder how that is being viewed. And I don't know, Ambassador, if you wanted to add anything on that, of bigger powers not respecting rules and norms that are set out by the charter that are always advocated, but perhaps they fall short in actually accepting them. I'll turn to you first, Nilanthi, on that.
Sure, it's a good question, because there is an aspect of in strategic competition, great power competition. It's not only about military interests and power. There's a strong normative dimension to the topic, talking about the rules-based order and upholding international law. So as you said rightly, that there is a tension when we're looking at the reaction or the lack of reaction to the ICJ decision or ICJ opinion, I should say, on the Chagos issue with Mauritius. And I think it's difficult for the United States because Diego Garcia is in those islands, and it's been such an important military base, not only to support support operations westward in Middle East hotspots, but also to support operations eastward. So it's, and of course, the United States is not a resident power in the Indian Ocean. So it gets that access through the UK. And I think it's even more difficult now with AUKUS. Really, and looking at the UK and its ambitions as it's going more forward in terms of its presence in the region, and has talked about actually trying to use that base more. So it definitely exposes that tension between U.S. strategic interest, operational level interest, but that normative focus on upholding the rules-based order.
Ambassador Prasad, if you wanted to add.
Thanks. But first, let me. I want to apologize for US and the Indo-Pacific mention. Do also remember US is a Pacific, is our neighbor in the Pacific, Guam and Fiji and Samoa and American Samoa. These are all part of the same neighborhood, and we meet America some 2,000 miles away from America is closer to Fiji than Sydney is, because we meet it about 2,000 miles away in Matthew Anta. It's one part of Kiribati. So it's part of very much part of the mix further north here, Hawaii, etc. So US is very much a part of this region, and the airspace of much of the Northern Pacific coming all the way down to near the equator is something that is managed by the US side. And we take over the airspace slightly south of the equator before we give it to Australia and New Zealand further south. So in so many these aspects of sovereignty, we're right alongside each other. So that's I think, slight variation on US in the Pacific. And we'd like the US relationship, therefore, to be one between neighbors rather than a distant superpower, as we have said many times before, because we meet them right next to each other, us, rather than in distant and cold Washington, many miles away. On the second part,
on the norms and kind of
norms, international on the
law.
So this really matters to us, right? It's so fundamental to us because it's an international governance framework that our sovereignty is best protected and best reinforced. The law of the sea, something that all the Pacific Islands have worked very hard on for many decades. Got over the line in 1982. Fiji is the first signatory to that. Fiji is also the first signatory to the Paris Treaty, and that made us large ocean states. Before that, we were really small countries with the 12-mile zone, etc. And you could do virtually anything in what we thought were our own waters. But more than that, it helped define where what our boundaries look like, as much as the line between Canada and US matters to US and Canadians, or US and Mexico matters to Mexicans and Canadians in exactly the same way. The lines on the blue lines on the ocean matters to us. In it are resources, in it is tuna, in it also lies our sovereignty. And overall respect for this is matters. In each of the international law setting, there would be some type of mechanism through which we resolve issues. And in the Pacific, some of the borders are still, boundaries are not defined yet. We are working that through in the frameworks that have been given within these laws. So that's how international law makes and operates, and that's why it really matters to us. And so it is true in every aspect of law. Not every country respects international frameworks. Look at Russia in Ukraine, or in fisheries. 1 in 3 fish tuna from the Pacific is an illegal tuna. It's probably an illegal tuna you've had at Subway. I do not necessarily mean that before you may have come into this meeting, but 1 in 3 tuna from the Pacific is an illegal one. Who caught that and who brought that into US market? I do not know whether it's a US fishing fleet or it's Indonesian fishing fleet or Vietnamese fishing fleet or our own, I doubt it. But that's true. The loss of tuna to illegal fisheries in Pacific, we estimate, is almost equal to the grant assistance that goes to the Pacific, the sum total of the grant assistance that goes to all the Pacific islands. That's the sum total. So we have a big problem on that side. Nevertheless, we find great reassurance in the international framework that underpins this, right? Because we have some sense that what is legal and what is illegal. We have some sense of, okay, how should we approach it? And some sense of when we talk to partners, including the US, that let's think a little bit more about maritime security and cooperation in the maritime space for us very pragmatically to try to wrestle with this problem. So it really matters to us, small states, and I'm not saying that it is large states only that that stand in breach of this. But if you didn't have that, what would you have?
Thank you, Ambassador. Tomorrow we have a panel on maritime security where we hopefully will be discussing much of this. But I have a few minutes before for audience Q&A. If there are any questions from the audience, there should be someone with a mic coming to you. The lady right here.
Thank you. Hi.
If you could introduce yourself and also who your question is directed at.
Okay. My name is Peter Milan. I'm one of your cousins from the Indian Ocean side of Australia. And unfortunately, my people have done catastrophic failure at protecting our biodiversity and resulting climate change impacts on the country. Part of that is, I think, in large due to the systematic destruction of our Indigenous folks and the inherent wisdom and knowledge and understanding of biodiversity through that process. A lot of what we're experiencing now is a result of fairly white Western concepts of extractive economics run predominantly by our large continents and countries. So how do you see your role as native to your countries in the Pacific and in Indian Pacific as stewards for the preservation of what is left of life in our oceans, and also on your country's landscape, whilst balancing the need for growth and economic development, because growth is still very much seen as very linear direction growth, and is measured as a sense of well-being of countries, but it's not really because it doesn't factor in those costs. So how do you see your need to balance that? And how does that work, given that our monetary systems and financial systems support that economic growth concept?
We'll take one more question, two questions.
I'm Abraham Joseph, and I've been interested in the SITS issue in particular because I have helped in establishing the Office of the High Representative for Least Developed, Landlocked, and Small Island States, and then also helping in the organization of the Mauritius SITS 10-year, program. So I know a lot of challenges are faced by the SITS group of countries. A thought has often come to me, have the SITS group ever thought about getting established a SITS bank, so that you could use those resources instead of waiting from bilaterals and multilaterals. Of course, you can have from them, but also having a SITS bank, I think that can help a lot, because you're faced with, especially on climate issues, if a cyclone or something happens, the economy gets completely crushed and it takes a long time to recover. And my next question is relating to the transparency issue by countries on maritime issues. When naval ships particularly come to countries, there is need for countries to be transparent beforehand, that they need to inform the neighboring countries. You have rightly mentioned about what happened in Sri Lanka. there was an agreement between Sri Lanka and India that any naval ships coming, they will inform 6 months in advance. But Sri Lanka did not abide by that. So I like I think you have mentioned about it. And what I'm trying to put forward is that there is need for transparency by countries on maritime issues. That includes also on fishing and also on narcotics too. So that's my question. Thank you.
We'll just take these two questions now, and then we'll come back to Ambassador Prasad, if you want to.
First one? Or?
Yeah, whichever way you want.
So I'll take the first the biodiversity one. We'll leave the sixth one. Is that okay? I'm happy to also take that. On the biodiversity, I think you'll find the Pacific voices very, very loud right now in the biodiversity international agenda. The world is leading to is trying to agree a new treaty framework for biodiversity protection. And in Montreal, the global community will meet in December, and North Pacific and Indian Ocean island states and the Caribbean island states are working together quite well, I must say, and we hope that we will be able to get a treaty framework on protection of biodiversity. How countries balance it, and obviously, countries have to find their own balance. This is all very, very difficult, and I cannot talk for other countries. Fiji, for example, has taken a precautionary approach, for example, on seabed mining. We have declared a 10-year moratorium on seabed mining in our waters, and the thinking is probably that there will be a permanent ban on deep sea seabed mining in our waters. Other countries have taken different views in balancing economic growth and protection of biodiversity. How we have come to it is that we are not very sure that the science is there yet. We are not very sure that the technology is tested yet. And until we are sure, we're at least postponing the decision by another 10 years. So that's one part of it. Fiji, Palau, and all of the Pacific Islands, you will know, are beautiful, as are Indian Ocean Islands. And one prime driver of our livelihood is tourism. I don't think tourism industry will be very strong and healthy if our biodiversity were collapsed, if our reefs were totally collapsed, and there was nothing much to be enjoyed in our oceans, on the beaches and the reefs and on the hills and mountains. So there's also a very deep economic interest in the approach that we take to biodiversity and environmental protection. And tourism means jobs, livelihoods, incomes, and that then we push back into much for climate and environmental actions. So that's sort of the way Fiji comes out at it. Other countries may take a slightly different mix. We think this will work for us, but in the end, none of these matters if we don't stay between 1.5. There's nothing left to protect, at least in the oceans beyond 1.5. Most of the reef systems have collapsed. Already at 1.2, the last surviving reef systems between Fiji, Solomon Islands, and that great one part of the Great Barrier on the northern parts. That's the belt that probably can survive 1.2 and beyond. And at 1.5 and beyond, that's what the oceanic scientists are telling us. There isn't much left. So that's a problem that even if all of us in Pacific got our head together, in Australia and New Zealand and Pacific were exactly on the same wavelength, we could not solve our own. That we need global consensus. That's our geopolitics.
Do you want to say anything on the seeds banks?
On the seeds bank, fantastic idea. Please have a discussion. Philemone, our economist, is sitting at the back. Often we get, and he's doing right now a paper, and I think there's a lot to be said about that. We are deeply frustrated, as I said, with much of the international financing instruments. It's getting slightly on the angrier side, and he's drafting a note that we've been discussing within Fiji and the Pacific on whether hereafter there should simply be a SITS window in climate finance. We're done with competing with India and the large countries and Africa and others for growing these small amounts of climate finance. That may be one way that we could lock in. And the same is our thinking on the multilateral side. That multilateral finance, we should simply have SITS windows with SITS procedures, with fast-forwarded, rapid assessment and rapid deployment of funds that are more SITS specific. So that's one part of the thinking. But SITS bank is something that people have been talking about. SITS will not have money to put into the bank. We all have, it's very complicated. I think even if we put our money because of a cruel global financial system, it will not have AAA rating. It will have BB minus or C, that type of rating. And probably the private sector will not look at it favorably because the ratings institutions or financial institutions is probably at the heart of the way in which the global power machinery operates in a systematic way that every day, every second undermines some aspect of the sovereignty of smaller states. That's the heart of it. It's something above my pay grade. It's probably something above SITS pay grade. It's a problem that our developed partners need to fix for us.
Thank you, Ambassador. Nilanthi, if I may turn to you on the transparency question and any of the other ones that you want to.
Yes, well, the SITS bank, that's a very intriguing idea. I'd be curious how that would look in an Indian Ocean islands context. But with regard to your question about transparency and the Sri Lanka question on that ship visit, I'm not familiar in my read of the analysis about the visit, about the 6 months in advance notification. I think operationally, though, that's a long time to have to give notification. It does not lend itself nicely to shorter term visits, less than 6 months. But I think at the heart of this, though, it gets to the question about agency and expectations about agency, whether it's Sri Lanka in that sense or Maldives in another context. And this is a country where there's a kind of a default yes in terms of providing that diplomatic clearance for visiting ships. And that's why the Chinese submarine that visited in 2014, that's why that was so controversial, because it's just a default to yes, because it's so much of Colombo port is about accepting that traffic. So I think it's really a question about agency for smaller states, but clearly Sri Lanka had to contend with India because there is that asymmetry of power in their relationship. So right, whatever, I'm not familiar with whatever the specific notification mechanisms were, but I think there is a deeper issue here in terms of smaller states and their desire to provide diplomatic clearances to visiting ships when they want to do it. But then they have to contend with some of these larger geopolitical issues from larger states.
I think we have time for just one more question, and if we can have the mic to Sean there.
Thank you. Prasad, I'm a senior editor with Hindustan Times, which is one of India's largest dailies. One quick question each to the two panelists. Ambassador Prasad, could you give us a sense of, you said climate is the most important thing for these islands, and I think that point is well taken. Could you give us a sense of what your negotiations are like with India on the issue of climate? India does not have a net zero commitment for 2050, it's 2070. During multilateral negotiations, do you see convergences? Do you see divergences? Do you see coordination? Are you frustrated? Nilanthi, on smaller states, and I thought that perspective that framework was very useful. Sometimes in the early stages of great power competition, smaller states find themselves in a sweet spot. Their negotiating power is high, they can extract benefits from all powers, and then there comes a point when the great power competition starts affecting domestic politics, right? And starts creating a degree of instability. And I think we've seen that in Maldives in the past few years, and to some extent in Sri Lanka. Could you give us a sense of how geopolitics is intersecting with domestic political stability in some of the smaller island states on the Indian Ocean side? Thank you.
Master Prasad, do you want to take that?
On the first one, it's very clear. We'll keep on saying unambiguously, and every time we get with India and every other country come to zero, not net zero by 2050. And I just gave you one example of why that matters to us. Beyond 1.5, there isn't much of a oceanic life in the way we know it. And our livelihood depends on that, our survival depends on that, and for too many of us, our very identity and culture and everything else depends on that. So that's every country has its own levels of difficulties, and however difficult these things are, you have to talk these things through. Some of these discussions we have in a difficult way inside the G77 plus China framework in the United Nations, in the UNFCCC process, and you'll find us sit often in different rooms, and the rest of the larger countries of the G77 in other rooms, and then we converge and we try to get over the line, and we just have to stay with it. There's no way of we're not there yet, but I hope we get there soon.
Thank you, Ambassador. Nilanthi, on the question of.
Sure. I think that's a really interesting question because you hear this a lot when you're looking at smaller states and the view that these smaller states they get into that sweet spot, as you termed it. I really question how long they can stay in that sweet spot because just as smaller states, they have a lesser capacity, lesser capability. So I really question just how, whether that really holds up, that hypothesis about smaller states being in a sweet spot and extracting concessions from larger powers. I know that's certainly a view that you do hear among larger powers about being played off, smaller states trying to do that, playing off the larger powers. But I really wonder from a small state's perspective, just how tenable that position is, or how long that's possible to be in that sweet spot. In terms of affecting domestic politics, it's an important issue because the larger countries in the region, there are longstanding historical ties to politicians in the country and just cultural interactions. So it's, you look at India, obviously has enduring ties with Sri Lanka, civilizational lens, but then you have China coming in as well. So it's I think it gets down to agency for the leadership in power, and it's complicated though because they are so accustomed, the Sri Lankans, Maldivians, to having to work with India. India is a friend in the case of the Sri Lankan crisis, a much needed friend in terms of the assistance India has offered. But at the same time, there is that historical anxiety about India's reach and that asymmetry of power. So I think it's just this question about domestic politics. It's inevitable that situation is going to exist when we're talking about India and Sri Lanka. It's unavoidable.
Thank you, Nilanthi. And I think we are slightly over time. And with that, please join me in thanking both the speakers for this panel. Thank you so much for joining us and for setting the stage. Just an administrative note, we have a 15-minute break before we reconvene here for the keynote address by Minister Abdullah Shahid, President of the 76th session of the General Assembly. Please join us for some coffee and tea outside. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
For coming.